Howdy ESSM 406. Welcome to the fourth lecture for this class. This lecture is intended to be a very brief introduction to some key ideas about policy analysis and studying the policy process. What do we mean by policy? This is something that's discussed in the textbook reading that I gave you a chapter from by Birkeland. Birkeland points out that there's a lot of different definitions. For the purposes of this class, I want you to think about the following definition. Policy are authoritative decisions about who gets what, when, and how. Public policies are those that have to do with the broad public sector, meaning society at large, but we can also have private policies. You might have a policy in your house or a policy in your dorm. And we can actually think about those kind of policies using very similar conceptual tools. How are policies made? Policies are made through political processes. This is really important, and I actually think this is one of the most challenging pieces of this class for most students in this class, most of you who are coming to this class from a scientific background. You're in a science major, you're mostly taking natural science courses, and you're used to the idea that in most cases there's kind of a right answer, there's maybe a best way for doing something. And there might be a best way to carry out a policy, but that's not how policy is made. Policy is made through politics. It's made through power, through argument, and through conflict. That means that we don't always get our way. Even when we have the right analysis, even when we can prove that our policy is better than the policy that the other guy has, for whatever reason. If the political process doesn't work in our favor, we're not going to win. So political processes do not lead to optimal outcomes. They lead to the outcomes that political processes lead to, and they're often quite indeterminate outcomes. So policies may be revisited, a policy may be made, a law may be passed at the national level, but then there may be a court case against it. Say, take the large Healthcare Reform Act passed in 2009 or 2010 that has become to be known as Obamacare. There's been court cases about it. They keep changing the implementing rules. A lot of what was said in the policy, in the law, they've kind of had to tweak it because maybe it's not working out. Maybe in a year or two, there may be a new law passed to fix some of those problems. States are implementing it in different ways. So there isn't an authoritative end to policy making. Two very important things to understand that I've already referred to. Values matter a lot. This is emphasized in the chapter by Laser, who also talks a bit about who the major actors who might have values are. Values are extremely important in the political process. Again, to go to the Healthcare Reform Act example, some people think that we need healthcare reform in this country because it's wrong, morally wrong, to have people who don't have access to healthcare, right? Other people think it's morally wrong for the government to interfere in private markets. Neither of those are analytic points. We can't say it would be optimal if the government didn't intervene in healthcare markets. Actually, there's quite a bit of evidence that it might be optimal for a lot of government intervention. For example, Canada and most of the European countries have lower cost healthcare systems that deliver very similar outcomes to the US, and they have heavily government dominated systems. So it might be optimal, we don't know, we're not healthcare analysts, but it might be optimal to have a government run healthcare system, but that goes against some people's values, and that's why we don't have it. And values are very important. Values are legitimate. Believing in freedom of speech, believing in freedom of the press, believing in freedom of religion, believing in the right to choose your own job, those are all values, and those are important values. Second thing, structure matters. We have a lot of evidence from studying, particularly from studying how legislatures work, that who is sitting at the table and what the order that decision options are given actually has a very big influence on what the outcome is. So oftentimes we'll see that people want to change the venue of where a decision is getting made. this shouldn't be a federal decision, this should be a state decision, right? That's a big argument that some people have made. Or this should be a federal decision and not a state decision in the United States. Well, maybe people have values about the relative value of smaller versus larger governments. And I admit that. But we also recognize that the national government and the state governments often have different priorities. And so moving a decision from one level to the other level will lead to different outcomes. For example, in the 1950s, Texas and most of the southeastern states had a lot of racial segregation. One of the ways that that was eliminated was the federal government said, these things that the states used to make decisions about, that we used to allow these southern states to make decisions about, we are no longer going to allow the southern states to make decisions about that. The national government is going to step in and impose a solution on the southern states. So structure matters. In this class, we're going to learn a bunch of conceptual tools for thinking about policies. Most of these come from the perspective that I come from, which you'll learn is an institutionalist perspective, and you'll learn more about what that means. This perspective, although it is value-laden, all scientific observation is value-laden, this perspective leads you to analysis that within that analysis you have right and wrong answers. So sometimes in this class I'll say, okay, is this the right answer or is this the right answer? That's distinct from my saying, is this the right policy or is that the right policy? I'm going to teach you analytic tools for thinking about the relative merits of policies. Those analytic tools have right and wrong answers. You can disagree about whether the implications of those are that this or that policy should be adopted. Maybe an implication is that we should adopt a certain policy, but you think that policy is morally wrong. That's very legitimate. So, there is no correct policy. Policy decision-making is a political process. And we'll talk more in the next lecture, which I'll record in a minute, about some of the dangers of studying political processes for the purposes of this class.